Maldives. And then I'm going to explain the methods that I use, followed by the results and a conclusion. So to start off, obviously you all know that coral reefs are very important. They cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but they provide resources for over 25% of marine life. So they're really important for coastal protection. They prevent against storms, flooding, erosion, food. They're a huge protein source for a lot of places. Education, science, they're beautiful. And on top of that, bioactive compounds, they're a treasure trove of different things that could provide medicines for us. Tourism, they're incredibly important for tourism. People go places to look at coral reefs, to snorkel, to scuba dive, and they provide jobs as well. So we have all these values from coral reefs, but they're also incredibly threatened. So currently, we've lost over 27% of reefs worldwide. 75% are severely threatened, and if we keep going at the current climate scenario, by 2050, 90% will be severely threatened. And there's lots of threats, so unsustainable tourism, pollution, climate change is the primary threat that we're seeing nowadays, destructive fishing practices, and coastal development. So here I'm going to specifically focus on the Maldives, which actually have the 8th largest reef system in the world. So the reefs there make up 5% of the global total. And in this region, you can find almost 2,000 different species of fish and almost 200 species of coral. And here, the two principal industries for the Maldives are tourism and fishing. So that just goes to show how important the reef system and the reefs are to the people there. So tourism actually makes up 32% of the gross domestic product, and it employs over 50% of the population. And people go to the Maldives because you want to go see the crystal white sand and the turquoise waters. So that's a huge draw there. And people do go because they want to snorkel and because they want to dive. So fishing used to actually be the #1 industry, but now it's been replaced by tourism, but it still is important. It makes up 9% of the GDP, provides 17% of jobs, but it's a huge source of income in terms of exports. So 66% of exports from the Maldives are because of the fishing industry. On top of that, the Maldives is a small island developing state, so they don't really have a lot of economic resources, so they really do rely on coral reefs for these two industries, as well as for coastal protection. So they're low-lying. There's almost 1,200 islands that make up the Maldives, and over 80% of them actually are less than 1.5 meters above sea level. So they really need corals as a natural barrier to protect against storms and erosions. This is a huge threat for them. So they're very important to the Maldives, essentially. Takeaway message. And they're facing threats. So coral mining is one of the big threats that they've seen. And that was really big in the 1970s when tourism started to expand, because coral is literally the building block of the Maldives. So they use it to build their houses, they use it to build their roads, and when they started to increase in tourism, they needed to mine more coral so that they could build these structures. But coral mining is actually really destructive to the reefs because it takes away they use crowbars and go in and break off the top layer of coral. So after they do that, the sections of reef where that's done, they really don't recover. Studies have shown that there's no recovery or very, very slow recovery in those areas. So coral mining was one of the reasons why we've seen a decline in the reefs in the Maldives. And another reason is bleaching. So coral bleaching events are starting to increase in frequency and intensity. And in 1998, there was a mass bleaching event that affected pretty much all of the reefs worldwide, but was really significant in this region. So over 90% of the reefs in the Maldives were affected, and a lot of them lost huge amounts of coral cover. So coral cover went from 45% to 5% on some reefs, which is a huge decline. So then the reefs they do have an ability to naturally get better. So that started occurring, but then there was another bleaching event that happened in 2016, which further reduced the health of the reefs and further reduced the coral cover in this area. So coral reefs are incredibly important for the Maldives. They provide them with a lot of their economic resources. They're also important for protection, but they're very threatened, not only because of the reasons we saw on the previous slide, but because of bleaching and coral mining and different threats like that. So it's very important that this area takes measures to protect these resources, because without it, they won't really be able to grow or prosper. However, in the Maldives, there's a lack of knowledge and there is a lack of resources to take advantage of protecting them. So one method that's been really popularized in the Caribbean and that's more widely used now is coral gardening, which has been shown to recover a proportion of habitat goods and services via anthropogenic manipulation. And it's based off of terrestrial forestry, so growing trees, and it's done in two methods. So the first is you have a nursery phase where you put the corals in an environment, a good environment for them, enhanced water flow, optimal light, less sedimentation. You can eliminate essentially predation or greatly reduce it. So they're able to grow a lot in this setting. If you see this top picture here, you can see a coral fragment at the start in the nursery, and then this is after 9 months. So after the corals have grown in the nursery, then the second phase is to transplant them back onto the reef. So transplanting or outplanting is what it's called, and essentially you're taking the coral and gluing it back onto the reef. And they found that transplanted corals in certain studies, they show less disease and less parasites than their natural counterparts. So this is a really popular methodology that has proven to be very successful. So what I wanted to look at was how coral gardening works in the Maldives, because it hasn't really been tested in that area. Like I said, it's widely used in the Caribbean and in a lot of regions. However, in the Maldives, I really couldn't find any case studies that talked about the use of coral gardening there. So the methodology I used was based off of Reef Rescuers, which is an organization that's based in the Seychelles, and they do a lot of workshops, and they are a really good organization that does coral gardening. And this study was done at Vela Private Island, which is this island here, and success was measured based off of percent coral cover, which is a really important indicator of reef health, and also survival rates, which is one of the most common metrics that you'll see to judge if a restoration program is successful or not. So it's easier to show it via video. This is what the nursery looks like. So you have these PVC structures that are underwater in the shape of a rectangle with ropes where the corals are hung. Divers have to go in and clean the ropes and clean the pipes as well. That's me. And the nurseries are super cool because you actually find a little mini ecosystem inside of them. So you'll see little fish, you'll see little crabs. So not only when you're transplanting onto the reef are you helping the reef, but the nursery system itself is its own unique ecosystem. So after the corals have been in the nursery, then the next step, as I said, is to transplant them. So the transplant site, the way we set it up is this is the island. So the north side of the island, we set up 3 transplant sites, which are denoted by the green. And they also had control sites, which were degraded sites since the reef itself is degraded, which is denoted by the red. So there was 3 sections total, and each section had 125 plots, which are a meter squared. And each plot has 8 corals in it. There's 5 different depths, so it's 50 meters by 5 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters, 6 meters, 7 meters. And there's 25 plots monitored total, 5 per depth, if that makes sense. So you can see here the monitored plots are denoted by the green. And plots were monitored, oh wait, that's not what I wanted to say now, never mind. So to transplant the corals, so here you can see Emma, this was one of my interns. She has set up a plot, a 1 meter squared plot. And what you do is first you actually clean off the substrate. So she has a brush there. You won't see her using it, but you use it to remove off any algae so that the coral has a better chance to attach. Then you use marine cement to stick the coral onto the reef. That's what this gray stuff is here, and that's what you can see her holding. And she's wafting to make sure that it's stuck, because if a wave comes, you don't want to spend all this time transplanting and then have the coral just get blown away. So that's how you transplant the corals onto the reef, and they actually will grow over the cement. So normally it takes somewhere between 3 and 6 months, and they'll attach themselves to the reef. So it's just a method to hold them there before they can actually self-attach. So then once the corals have been transplanted onto the reef, then we monitored their health. So this is how we figured out the survival rate. And the health is monitored on a binary scale based on the amount of living tissue, or the amount of dead tissue rather. So it would be a 1 if it was completely healthy with 0% tissue death, 2 with 1 to 25% tissue death, and so on and so forth. And health monitoring is done every 3 months. The other thing for monitoring percent coral cover, this was done using photo quadrats. So here you can see you have the photo quadrat, which is just PVC pipes essentially. And then you take a camera and take a picture of each 1 meter squared plot. And then we use the program CPCE, Coral Point Count, with Excel to measure the different benthos. So basically it lays out this grid and you manually go in and annotate what is the benthos at each point. And these were the different categories that we used. And what we found was the change in percent coral cover. We based this off of a scale from Gomez and Yap, which basically says that a reef with 0 to 25% has poor coral cover. 26 to 50% is moderate, 51 to 70% is good, and 76 to 100% is excellent. So you can see the darker blue line on top is showing the transplanted coral cover percentage, whereas the line on the bottom is the degraded percentage. So we can see obviously that there's a higher percent of coral cover in the transplant plots than the degraded plots. Which obviously you're probably thinking, Megan, well, you added coral, there's going to be more coral. So yes, that's true, but you can see here that it is showing a positive trend going up. And even from here, the T0, so these are each the 3-month intervals, and this is pre-transplant, we can see that there is a positive trend for all of the transplanted plots. They're all increasing. This is just to show you kind of specifically what it would look like in coral point count. So here you can see this is a plot at T0, so right after the corals have been transplanted, and this is the same plot 1 year later. So you can see here how much more space the corals are taking up and how much they've grown. And to further show an example of that, here again is a coral that you can see throughout its life on the reef for a year. And you can see how it's taking up much more space, it's grown, there's a lot more 3D structure. So then looking at survival rates, I wanted to compare this to the theoretical average. So what we see typically in a coral restoration study to kind of see if the methodology was successful. So I found a meta-analysis that looked at different survival rates in lots of different studies. And they found that on average, there was a 66% survival rate. So we had survival rates of 87.7%, 68.9%, and 72.8%. So all of them were higher than the theoretical average. And using a chi-squared analysis, I found that sections 1 and 3 were significantly higher. Section 2 was not significantly higher, but it was still higher. So what we saw overall was that there was a higher survival rate using this methodology. And typically in the Maldives, they use reef frames, so you put out a frame and grow corals on that. And I did find one study that said that they had a 68% survival rate, but only after 8 months. So if you put it for another 4 months, you would see some declines. I don't want to guesstimate the number, but it would be lower than that. So my conclusion is that coral gardening methodology in the Maldives did show an increase in percent coral cover. And we saw a survival rate that was higher than average as cited by the literature. So overall, I would say that coral gardening methodology is successful in the Maldives. Thank you. Questions?